The moment my mother-in-law raised her glass and laughed at me in front of 40 guests, she thought she had finally put me in my place. I remember standing beside my husband, Ethan, in the grand dining room of his parents' estate, forcing a polite smile while the sound of silverware and quiet conversations filled the room. The annual Parker family gathering was one of those events everyone seemed to look forward to except me. For years, I had walked into rooms like that feeling as though I was being measured, judged, and quietly dismissed before I even said a word. Victoria Parker, my mother-in-law, had perfected the art of making someone feel small without ever raising her voice. She smiled while doing it. She laughed while doing it. And somehow that made it hurt even more. That evening, the room glowed under crystal chandeliers, and every table was decorated with white roses imported from another state because Victoria insisted that local flowers were never good enough. The guests were successful business owners, attorneys, investors, and people who loved talking about money almost as much as they loved showing it. I never belonged in their world, at least not in their eyes. To them, I was simply the woman Ethan married despite their expectations. I came from a modest family. I drove my car until it was no longer practical. I preferred quiet weekends over luxury vacations. None of those things bothered me. What bothered me was how often they confused simplicity with weakness. As dessert was served, Victoria stood to make a toast. She spoke about family, tradition, success, and legacy. Then her eyes landed on me. The smile appeared. The one I knew too well. She thanked everyone for contributing to the family's achievements and then added, with a light laugh, that not everyone was fortunate enough to understand what real success looked like. Several guests chuckled. One woman glanced at me before quickly looking away. I felt the familiar sting in my chest. Ethan shifted beside me but said nothing. He rarely challenged his mother publicly. I could not entirely blame him. Growing up under Victoria Parker was probably its own education in survival. I lowered my eyes toward my coffee cup and reminded myself of the promise I had made years earlier. Never argue. Never compete. Never prove your worth to people determined not to see it. The evening continued, but something felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that no matter how many holidays, birthdays, and family dinners passed, nothing would change. Victoria still believed she knew exactly who I was. Richard still treated me like an afterthought. Most of the family followed their lead. As the conversations drifted around me, I quietly stared through the window at the dark garden outside. What none of them knew was that my life looked very different when I stepped away from their tables and their opinions. They thought they understood me. They thought they had already written my story. And sitting there that night, listening to their laughter, I had no idea that before the week was over, a single phone call would make every one of them question everything they thought they knew about me. Driving home from the gathering, neither Ethan nor I said much. The highway stretched ahead under the glow of streetlights, and the silence between us felt heavier than usual. I stared out the passenger window and replayed every moment from the evening, especially Victoria's toast. The truth was that it had not been one comment or one dinner that hurt. It was years of small moments that slowly piled up until they became impossible to ignore. When Ethan and I first got married, I genuinely believed his family would get to know me over time. I thought that if I was kind, respectful, and patient, eventually they would see me as part of the family. Instead, every holiday seemed to create a new reminder that I did not belong. I remembered our first Thanksgiving after the wedding. Victoria had assigned seats for everyone at the table. Somehow I ended up at the far end beside two distant relatives while Ethan sat near his parents discussing business opportunities. When I offered to help in the kitchen, Victoria smiled and said that at least I could contribute something useful. Everyone laughed. I laughed too because I did not know what else to do. A year later. During Richard's birthday celebration, someone asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Victoria jumped in and explained that I preferred simple projects and a quiet life. The way she said it made it sound as though I lacked ambition. Nobody asked any follow-up questions. They simply nodded and moved on to discussing investments and luxury real estate. There were dozens of moments like that. Family vacations where my opinions were ignored. Charity events where introductions conveniently skipped over me. Conversations that stopped whenever I joined the group. None of it was dramatic enough to call out. That was what made it so effective. Every slight was small enough to deny, but together they created a message that was impossible to misunderstand. You are not one of us. Ethan noticed some of it. I know he did. Occasionally he apologized afterward, promising that his parents meant well. Sometimes he defended them. Sometimes he defended me. Most of the time he simply hoped everyone would get along. I never blamed him completely because family loyalty can be complicated. Still, there were nights when I lay awake wondering whether things would ever change. When we reached home, Ethan finally spoke. He told me his mother had gone too far. I thanked him, but my voice sounded distant even to myself. After he went upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour. The house was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. I thought about the promise I had made years ago. Never chase approval from people committed to misunderstanding you. That promise had helped me survive every family gathering, every backhanded compliment, every dismissive smile. What nobody in the Parker family realized was that while they spent years judging me, I had spent those same years building something meaningful. Something bigger than their assumptions. Something they had never once thought to ask about. And in just a few days, a situation none of us saw coming would bring two worlds together in a way that could never be undone. The next morning, my alarm rang at 6 o'clock, just as it always did. If someone from Ethan's family had followed me through my day, they would have been disappointed by how ordinary it looked. There was no luxury chauffeur waiting outside. No private jet. No glamorous office with my name on the top floor. I made coffee, answered a few emails, and drove across town in the same practical sedan I had owned for years. That was one of the reasons people underestimated me. They expected success to announce itself. They expected it to wear expensive labels and demand attention. I had learned a long time ago that real confidence rarely needed an audience. By 8 o'clock, I was seated in a conference room surrounded by people who knew a very different version of me than the one the Parker family imagined. Around the table sat executives, community leaders, and department directors. They greeted me warmly and immediately began discussing projects that affected thousands of families across several states. We reviewed budgets, long-term plans, and partnerships that had taken years to build. It was meaningful work. The kind of work that changed lives quietly, without making headlines. Most people who worked with me never cared what car I drove or how expensive my watch was. They cared whether I kept my promises. They cared whether I solved problems. They cared whether I treated people with respect. Those were standards I understood. During lunch, I received a message from Ethan asking how my day was going. I smiled and replied that everything was fine. I did not mention the meeting. I did not mention the contracts being finalized. I did not mention the decisions being made. Keeping those parts of my life private was never about secrecy. It was about principle. Years earlier, after one particularly uncomfortable family dinner, I had made a decision. I would never use success as a weapon. I would never walk into a room and demand validation. If someone respected me only after learning my accomplishments, then their respect was not worth very much. That belief had guided me through every interaction with Victoria and Richard. They had spent years evaluating me based on what they assumed rather than what they knew. Strangely enough, I no longer felt angry about it. Disappointed, yes. Hurt sometimes. But not angry. Anger requires energy, and I preferred investing my energy elsewhere. Late that afternoon, one of my senior managers stopped by my office carrying a folder. She informed me that an important development was expected within the next few days. Several organizations were waiting for a final decision, and if everything moved forward as planned, our responsibilities would expand significantly. I thanked her and reviewed the documents carefully. The opportunity was enormous. The kind of opportunity that could affect communities for years. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how different my worlds had become. In one world, I was still the woman people quietly dismissed at family gatherings. In the other, people trusted me with decisions that carried enormous responsibility. The contrast would have been amusing if it had not been so revealing. What I did not know was that events were already moving faster than anyone expected. Somewhere across town, a conversation was taking place that would soon connect those two worlds. And when that happened, the assumptions the Parker family had built over the years would begin to crack in ways none of us could stop. 3 days later, Victoria invited the family to another gathering, this time at the country club she loved so much. According to Ethan, it was supposed to be a casual afternoon luncheon. Experience had taught me that there was no such thing as a casual event when Victoria was involved. Every detail was carefully designed to impress someone. The valet parking, the perfectly arranged floral centerpieces, the guest list filled with influential names. By the time Ethan and I arrived, most of the family was already there. Victoria greeted us with her usual polished smile, the kind that looked warm from a distance but never quite reached her eyes. For the first hour, everything remained pleasant. People discussed travel plans, investment trends, and upcoming charity events. I listened politely and contributed when appropriate. Then the conversation shifted toward professional achievements. One by one, family members began sharing updates about promotions, acquisitions, and business milestones. I could already sense where the discussion was heading. Sure enough, Victoria eventually turned toward me. She smiled and asked whether I was still keeping myself busy with my little projects. Several people around the table laughed softly. It was the same tone she had used for years. Not openly cruel. Just dismissive enough to make her point. I felt every eye turn toward me. I answered calmly that work was going well. Victoria nodded as though she had expected nothing more. Then she began praising another relative who had recently appeared in a business magazine. For the next several minutes, she spoke enthusiastically about success, influence, and recognition. The implication was obvious. Real accomplishments were public. Real accomplishments came with status. Real accomplishments earned attention. I quietly stirred my iced tea and said nothing. Across the table, Ethan looked uncomfortable. He attempted to redirect the conversation, but Victoria continued. At one point, she mentioned how important it was for families to maintain high standards when choosing future generations of leaders. A few relatives exchanged awkward glances. Even Richard seemed slightly uneasy. Yet nobody challenged her directly. That was the pattern. Everyone saw it. Nobody stopped it. Years earlier, moments like this would have ruined my entire day. Now they mostly left me tired. I had spent too much time proving my resilience to let a few comments define my worth. Still, there was something different about that afternoon. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of everything that had happened before. Perhaps it was knowing that major developments were unfolding behind the scenes of my professional life. Whatever the reason, I found myself observing the room with unusual clarity. The conversations. The assumptions. The certainty with which people judged one another. It was remarkable how confident people became when they believed they knew someone else's story. As lunch came to an end, guests began standing and preparing to leave. Victoria appeared satisfied with herself. She had once again established the social order exactly as she saw it. But while everyone gathered their belongings, my phone vibrated inside my purse. I glanced at the screen and immediately felt my pulse quicken. The caller was someone who never contacted me unless the matter was extremely important. For a moment, I simply stared at the name. Then I stood from the table. What I did not realize was that the next few minutes would become the turning point none of us would ever forget. The moment I saw the caller's name on my screen, I knew I could not let it go to voicemail. I excused myself from the table and stepped toward a quieter area near the club's terrace. The afternoon sun reflected off the golf course beyond the windows, and for a brief second I considered walking outside for privacy. Before I could take another step, the call connected. The voice on the other end sounded both excited and nervous. The board had reached a final decision. After months of evaluations, negotiations, and planning, the partnership had officially been approved. I closed my eyes for a moment and absorbed the news. It was the opportunity we had been working toward for years. Thousands of families would benefit from the programs we would now be able to expand. The funding involved was substantial, but what mattered most to me was the impact. As the conversation continued, I asked several questions and reviewed key details. The person on the other end thanked me repeatedly for my leadership throughout the process. I reminded them that success was always the result of teamwork. It was a conversation I had experienced many times before, but this one carried unusual significance. What I did not realize was that several members of Ethan's family had gradually drifted closer while preparing to leave. The country club was not particularly crowded, and my voice carried farther than I intended. I remained focused on the call. We discussed implementation timelines, strategic partners, and the organizations involved. Then the caller mentioned a figure connected to the project. Even I paused briefly when I heard it spoken aloud. The number represented a scale that most people rarely encountered. Around me, the atmosphere seemed to change. I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Conversations that had filled the room moments earlier were fading. When I glanced up, I saw Victoria standing several feet away. Richard was beside her. A few relatives had stopped gathering their coats. Nobody said anything. They simply listened. The caller continued speaking, referencing leaders, executives, and institutions that most people only read about in national publications. Then came another sentence that made the silence even more noticeable. They referred to me as the primary person responsible for overseeing the initiative. For the first time, I became aware of the expressions around me. Confusion. Curiosity. Disbelief. I could almost see people trying to reconcile what they were hearing with the image they had carried of me for years. I finished the conversation professionally, confirmed a meeting for the following week, and thanked the caller before ending the call. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The room felt strangely frozen. Victoria looked as though she wanted to ask a question but could not decide where to begin. Richard stared at me with a level of attention he had never shown before. Even Ethan appeared surprised, though not because he doubted me. He simply had not known the full scale of what had been developing. Finally, one relative broke the silence and asked what exactly the call had been about. I considered giving a simple answer, but after everything that had happened over the years, I felt that perhaps it was time for at least a small part of the truth to be known. The question hung in the air as every eye remained fixed on me, and for the first time since joining the Parker family, they were not looking at me with judgment. They were looking at me because they genuinely wanted answers. For a moment, nobody moved. The room that had been filled with casual conversations only minutes earlier now felt completely different. I looked around and saw expressions I had never seen directed at me before. People were not dismissing me. They were not overlooking me. They were paying attention. The relative who had asked the question repeated it more carefully. What exactly was the call about? I took a slow breath before answering. I explained that I had been helping lead a multi-state initiative focused on expanding resources and opportunities for underserved communities. I kept my explanation simple because the details were complicated, but even the simplified version seemed to catch everyone off guard. Another family member asked how long I had been involved. When I answered that it had been several years, a few eyebrows rose immediately. Several years. The same years during which most of them assumed I spent my time working on insignificant projects. Victoria stood silently, her expression becoming harder to read with every passing second. Richard finally spoke. His voice carried none of its usual certainty. He asked why nobody in the family knew about any of this. I almost smiled at the question. The answer seemed obvious. Nobody had ever asked. For years, conversations around me had focused on assumptions rather than curiosity. People had decided who I was long before they considered learning anything about me. I explained that I preferred keeping my professional life separate from family gatherings. I never saw a reason to discuss accomplishments during holiday dinners or social events. Success was not something I viewed as a competition. The room grew even quieter. Then Ethan asked a question that surprised me. He wanted to know why I had never shared the full scope of my work with him either. His tone was not angry. It was sincere. I looked at him and told him the truth. He knew more than anyone else, but even he never seemed particularly interested in titles, funding numbers, or organizational structures. We built our marriage around trust, not resumes. He nodded slowly as though realizing something important. One of the guests then mentioned the organizations they had overheard during the phone call. The moment those names were spoken aloud, several people reacted visibly. Those organizations were respected nationwide. Suddenly, the room was filled with questions. How large was the project? How many people were involved? How had it grown so quickly? I answered politely but briefly. The more I spoke, the more uncomfortable Victoria appeared. For years, she had measured people through a very specific lens. Wealth, status, recognition, influence. Now she was discovering that the person she had underestimated possessed all of those things in ways she had never imagined. Yet what seemed to bother her most was not the scale of the project. It was the realization that none of it had ever been displayed for approval. The conversation eventually ended, but the atmosphere never returned to normal. People looked at me differently. They listened differently. As Ethan and I prepared to leave, Victoria stopped me near the exit. For the first time since I had joined the family, she seemed unsure of herself. She opened her mouth as though she wanted to say something important, then hesitated. Whatever she planned to say remained unfinished. But I could tell one thing with absolute certainty. The version of me she had believed in for years no longer existed in her mind, and the truth she had just discovered was only the beginning. The days that followed felt strangely unfamiliar. For years, I had grown accustomed to being overlooked whenever the Parker family gathered. Suddenly, the opposite was happening. My phone began receiving messages from relatives who had rarely spoken to me before. Some were polite. Some were curious. A few seemed almost eager to establish a connection they had never cared to build in the past. I answered everyone with the same courtesy I always had, but the change was impossible to ignore. The most surprising shift came from Richard. A week earlier, he could barely make it through a conversation with me without appearing distracted. Now he called twice within 3 days. The first call was brief and awkward. He asked about one of the organizations connected to my recent project. The second call lasted longer. He wanted to understand how community partnerships worked and how large initiatives were coordinated across multiple states. His questions were genuine. For the first time, he seemed interested in learning rather than judging. Victoria, however, remained more complicated. She did not call. She did not send messages. Instead, she communicated through silence. That silence spoke loudly. I could almost imagine the conversations happening inside her mind. For years, she had believed she understood exactly who I was. She had built an entire narrative around that belief. Admitting she had been wrong would require revisiting countless moments she had never questioned before. One evening, Ethan and I were having dinner at home when he brought up his parents. He admitted that both of them seemed shaken by everything they had learned. I asked whether they were upset. He shook his head and said it was something deeper than that. They were re-evaluating years of assumptions. His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Re-evaluating assumptions sounds simple in theory, but it can be one of the most uncomfortable experiences a person ever faces. It requires honesty. It requires humility. Most importantly, it requires acknowledging that you may have treated someone unfairly. A few days later, another family gathering took place. This time the atmosphere was completely different from the moment I arrived. People greeted me warmly. They asked thoughtful questions. They listened carefully when I spoke. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed the change. Instead, I felt conflicted. Part of me appreciated the respect. Another part wondered why that respect had taken so long to appear. During dinner, I noticed Victoria watching me several times. Whenever our eyes met, she quickly looked away. Near the end of the evening, she finally approached me while others were busy talking nearby. Her voice lacked its usual confidence. She told me she had spent the last week thinking about many things. Then she said something I never expected to hear. She admitted that perhaps she had not been as fair to me as she should have been. It was not a full apology. Not yet. But it was the closest she had ever come. I thanked her quietly. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it felt more significant than years of family dinners combined. As she walked away, I realized something important. The real change was not that people had discovered what I had accomplished. The real change was that they had finally started questioning the assumptions they once treated as facts. What none of us knew was that an even greater test was approaching, one that would reveal whether these changes were genuine or merely temporary. About 2 weeks later, I learned whether the changes inside the Parker family were truly real. It began with a phone call from Ethan late on a Thursday afternoon. His voice sounded unusually tense. He explained that Richard was facing a serious business problem. One of the largest projects his company had been pursuing for months was suddenly at risk. A key partnership had fallen apart unexpectedly, and without a replacement solution, the financial consequences could be significant. Ethan was careful with his words, but I could hear the concern underneath them. Richard had built his reputation over decades. Watching something important begin to unravel was not easy for him. That evening, Ethan and I drove to his parents' house. The atmosphere felt completely different from every previous visit. The usual confidence that surrounded Richard was gone. He looked exhausted. Victoria seemed equally worried. Several documents covered the dining room table. Charts, reports, projections, and meeting notes were scattered everywhere. When we arrived, nobody discussed social status. Nobody mentioned accomplishments. Nobody cared about appearances. They cared about solving a problem. For nearly an hour, I listened while Richard explained the situation. The more details he shared, the more familiar it sounded. Certain organizations. Certain contacts. Certain decision-makers. Names I recognized immediately. When he finally finished, silence settled across the room. Then Richard did something I never expected. He looked directly at me and asked whether I had any advice. Years earlier, a question like that would have been unthinkable. I took a moment before responding. Part of me remembered every dismissive comment, every overlooked conversation, every time my perspective had been treated as unimportant. It would have been easy to remain silent. It would have been easy to say that the situation was not my responsibility. Nobody would have blamed me. Yet as I looked around the room, I realized something important. The people sitting before me were not acting like the people who had judged me years ago. They were worried. Humble. Human. I asked several questions and reviewed some of the documents. The more I examined the situation, the more certain I became that I could help. Not because I possessed some magical solution. Simply because many of the people involved happened to be part of networks I had worked alongside for years. I explained what I thought the next steps should be. Richard listened carefully. Victoria listened even more carefully. Neither interrupted. Neither challenged me. By the end of the discussion, I agreed to make a few calls and arrange several conversations that might open new opportunities. Relief immediately appeared on their faces. Yet what affected me most was not their gratitude. It was their attitude. They treated my suggestions with genuine respect. Not because they suddenly admired success. Not because they were impressed by titles. But because they trusted my judgment. As Ethan and I prepared to leave, Victoria walked us to the door. Before we stepped outside, she stopped me. Her eyes filled with an emotion I had rarely seen from her. Vulnerability. She thanked me quietly. Then she admitted that years ago she would never have imagined asking me for help. I smiled gently and told her that people sometimes surprise us when we take the time to know them. She nodded slowly. Neither of us realized it then, but the decisions made over the next few days would determine far more than the future of Richard's business. They would determine the future of our family as well.